Johnathan stood at the edge of the battlefield, his heart pounding in his chest. As a young soldier fighting for the American Revolution, he was torn between his duty to his country and his love for a British woman he had met before the war. Her name was Elizabeth, and she had stolen his heart from the moment their eyes had met. Before the war, Johnathan and Elizabeth had spent many blissful days together. They would explore the countryside, hand in hand, dreaming about their future together. But when tensions between America and Britain escalated into war, they found themselves on opposite sides of the conflict. Now, as Johnathan watched the British Army march towards the town where Elizabeth lived, he was filled with conflicting emotions. He had been assigned the task of leading the charge against her home, a duty that weighed heavily on his conscience. How could he raise his sword against the woman he loved? As the battle commenced, Jonathan's heart was torn apart. The sound of cannons and musket fire filled the air, drowning out the cries of the wounded. The smoke of the gunpowder clouded his vision, but he pressed forward, his mind in turmoil. Finally, he spotted Elizabeth amongst the chaos. Her face pale and filled with fear, she stood at the window of her home, watching the destruction unfold before her eyes. Jonathan's heart ached at the sight of her, and he knew he had to make a choice. With a heavy heart, he charged towards her home, leading his fellow soldiers. The realization of what he was about to do hit him like a punch to the gut, but he pushed past the doubt. Duty called, and he could not turn away. Reaching the front porch of Elizabeth's house, Johnathan locked eyes with her as she stood frozen in fear. His heart shattered at the sight, but he couldn't let his emotions get the best of him. He shouted orders for his soldiers to proceed and began to swing his sword towards the door, splintering the wood and breaking his own heart in the process. But just as Johnathan took another step forward, a cry stopped him in his tracks. Elizabeth's voice, filled with anguish and desperation, echoed through the chaos. "Johnathan, please. It's me, Elizabeth. I still love you." The world around him seemed to fade away as he turned towards her voice. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with sweat and blood. He dropped his sword, his hands trembling, and crossed the battlefield towards Elizabeth. Ignoring the protests of his fellow soldiers, Johnathan reached her side, gathering her into his arms. They clung to each other, desperate for solace amidst the destruction. In that moment, Johnathan knew that he could not fight against his love any longer. With his heart leading the way, Johnathan made his choice. He turned his back on the battlefield, on his fellow soldiers, and on his duty to his country. He would risk everything for love. Hand in hand, Johnathan and Elizabeth ran towards their future, leaving the chaos of war behind them.